And it actually goes live before it says that we're live, so.
All right, we're live.
Oh, we're live, great, okay. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. This is episode 14 of Our Path Forward. Our Path Forward is a weekly Facebook live show by Care Washington that gives viewers a behind the scenes look at the work that we do at Care Washington, while inviting them to join with us in reimagining what our path forward looks like in this post-Trump, soon to be inshallah post-COVID era. So today we are talking about the recent Block the Boat action protest in Seattle with Miriam Taqieddin, and she is a member of the Seattle-based group Falastiniyat. Very excited to have her today. I'll read a brief bio about Miriam. So Miriam is a member of the Seattle-based group Falastinyat. Falastinyat is a grassroots collective of diasporic Palestinian feminists. She's a recent graduate from Evergreen State College, where she received a bachelor's degree with an emphasis in public policy and political science. While there, Miriam conducted independent academic research and comparative analysis about the United States-Mexico border and the segregation walls in occupied Palestine. She has supported Falastiniyat's direct action work and community organizing. Falastiniyat recently organized a successful Block the Boat campaign in Seattle that made both local and national news. It was covered by the likes of AJ Plus and Newsweek. So very excited to have Miriam here. We are also joined by our executive director, Imran Siddiqui. He's the executive director of Care Washington and a prominent voice for justice in the American Muslim community. He has been a leading voice in the age of social media, starting online movements like the No Ban, No Wall campaign, and has appeared in media outlets across the world for his commentary and thoughts on a wide array of issues. So we're very happy to have you both with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jess.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So Miriam, I just wanted to start with you. Falastiniyat describes itself as, quote, a grassroots collective of diasporic Palestinian feminists. Hold on, I lost my. So a grassroots collective of diasporic Palestinian feminists in Seattle, living and organizing at the intersection of gender justice and anti-colonialism. Can you tell us more about Falastiniyat and the work that you all do, as well as a bit about yourself?
Yeah, totally. So Falastiniyat was founded a year ago. And what we mean when we say that we organize at the intersect of gender justice and anti-colonialism is that we treat the Israeli occupation as a feminist issue, which is something we'll talk about a little bit more later on. But so we prioritize uplifting queer and feminist Palestinian voices. And we work hard to build and maintain relationships across movements with groups like the International League of People's Struggles, or ILPS, and the Deadly Exchange and the Palestinian Feminist Collective. In terms of the work that we do, we engage in direct action, BDS, and legislative actions as well. And ultimately, we're working towards a liberated Palestine.
Awesome.
Yeah, so in terms of myself, my family is Syrian Palestinian, and I grew up in the United States. I longed for a deeper connection with my ancestral homelands since I can remember, but as I continued to educate myself and grew up, I realized that that may not be as possible as I once thought. And I was radicalized by my sister's work, who is a founder of Falastiniyat, as well as my own education of things like racism, settler colonialism, and police violence in the United States. And yeah, and this past year I attended a lot of direct actions during the ongoing struggle for Black liberation. And once I graduated college, I moved back to Seattle and joined Falastiniyat in the middle of the Block the Boat campaign. So
awesome.
Yeah.
You just said that ever since you can remember that you longed to have more of a connection with your background, your ancestral homeland, but that you've realized that maybe that's not possible. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, totally. So for Palestinians in the diaspora, returning to Palestine isn't the easiest thing, and a lot of us can't return. And there's that. And then I'm also Syrian, and Syria is also hard to travel to these days. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I didn't realize that your sister was one of the founding members of Falastinyat, so maybe we can talk more about that as well. So I saw in the news that with the Seattle Block the Boat action, I think it happened about a week ago, exactly, that 11 protesters were arrested during that protest. And this was a direct action that was organized by Falastinyat. Can you just talk about what is Block the Boat?
Yeah.
And can you talk about what happened in Seattle with this direct action?
Yeah, totally. So Block the Boat originated in 2014 as a solidarity movement with Palestinian workers. It's part of the BDS campaign, and it aims to divest from Israeli products to support Palestinian human rights. So it's a worldwide campaign against the Israeli profiteering, or the Israeli apartheid profiteering Zim shipping corporation. So we've seen Zim ships be blockaded in Oakland, Vancouver, Prince Rupert, British Columbia, New York, Italy, South Africa. All those ships were refused to unload because of their ties with Israel. So Falastiniyat partnered with AROC, or the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, to work on this campaign in Seattle. So we did that, and ultimately we were able to delay the Zim ship from docking for 10 days and from unloading for an additional 5 days once it was docked at the port. So yeah, so that's about Block the Boat. And in relation to the 11 people who were arrested, that was on Thursday, the 17th, which was our last picket, part of the campaign. And 11 of our protesters were met with extreme police violence on the side of SPD, which is nothing new, just for peacefully picketing the Zim ship. So that was like a clear example of how Israeli apartheid, racism, and police violence all go hand in hand.
Would you consider, so you guys were able to delay the ship from docking for 10 days, you said, and then unloading for 5 more? Did I get that right? That's pretty good, right? I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a win. There are a lot of outside circumstances that made the campaign in Seattle a little bit more difficult, but we definitely take this as a win, especially a BDS win.
Awesome, awesome.
Yeah.
Speaking of BDS, Imran, I want to bring you in here. I know that while you were the executive director of CARE Arizona, you had some, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I thought you had some run-ins with the courts over BDS, boycott, divest, and sanctions, boycott, divest, and sanctions over free speech issues. Can you talk about that and the work that you all did while you were at CARE Arizona?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can you also define what, for those maybe who don't know, what BDS is? Yeah,
for sure. I think, Miriam definitely outlines a lot of this really well in terms of boycotting Israeli products and organizations that are profiting off of the occupation. But if you rewind a little bit backward, if you look at the past 75 years of, or 3/4 of a century of occupation and apartheid that the Palestinians have had to undergo, there's always been a process of criminalization of Palestinians, no matter what, for objecting to their displacement and occupation, for objecting against being ethnically cleansed from their homelands. Then when you're resisting this occupation or defending yourself, you're also criminalized for doing that. And then, there's an old trope that's existed throughout time. You'll see this constantly on social media or Twitter and different places. Where's the Palestinian Gandhi, or where's the Palestinian Nelson Mandela? Like, if there only was a Palestinian who was non-violently resisting the occupation, then we would listen to them and we would uplift them and we would sanctify them as some type of saint in our society, and we would actually listen to the Palestinians. So then over the course of the past 2+ decades, even probably further than that, there's been, and this is rooted in overthrowing South African apartheid, where people actually boycotted and divested from apartheid South Africa. You saw a global movement. If you go back to even the 80s, people were saying, I'm not going to play Sun City and things like that. So there's a rich history of boycotting apartheid states. So this really just leads into the Palestinian movement. There's much of a relation there, and many people who are involved in the South African apartheid overthrow are also involved in Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement as well. So this is really just principled, multi-racial, multi-religious people of no religion at all coming together to boycott, divest, and sanction Israeli companies that are essentially profiting from the apartheid state. And so what's happening now after people are nonviolently resisting to this apartheid and occupation? Now they're saying, what's going on here? Like, we don't, this is wrong. This is, now they're trying to criminalize nonviolent action. So what happened to that question about the Palestinian Gandhi or the Palestinian Mandela? They used boycotts during their lifetime. So it's just the goalposts keep getting moved during this lifetime. So what you see is that now people who are profiting from or benefiting from the occupation and apartheid of Palestinians are now pushing for the criminalization of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So what you've seen on a federal level, you have senators and Congress people introducing legislation to try and outlaw the boycott and divestment and sanctions movement. You saw Benjamin Netanyahu at the UN make a big speech about criminalizing BDS back when he was prime minister as well. And this is taking shape even on a local and state level as well. So in states like Arizona and 20 to 30 others, just as you've seen like anti-Islam bills, like anti-Sharia bills, like in the early 2008 to 2016 timeframe, where those type of like criminalization bills have been introduced in legislatures. Now the focus is on Palestine activism on a local level, on a state level, federal level, and even on a university level as well. So you have, schools try to criminalize pro-BDS speech. You'll have states introduce laws that basically will make it illegal for the state to do business with anybody who is involved with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So what happened in 2015, Arizona passed this type of law, which is a violation of free speech on its very surface, but they passed the law because you have a very pro-Israel right-leaning legislature over there. And so then what happens, like, it's written into the law in a very sloppy way. So then the Muslim Students Association at ASU ends up having a speaker's contract where they wanted to bring somebody who actually supported the BDS movement come and speak to their group. And so when they sent the speaker's contract to the MSA over there, it had an anti-BDS clause in it. And so we, and the State Board of Regents and state of Arizona as well, and they came back and, went on a university level, they're very scared about like violating free speech. They want it to be a free speech hub. So like, oh no, we're not saying that he can't come and speak. So they quickly like amended the contracts. And so that ended up being a win in out of court against Arizona State University. But you'll see that this is happening in multiple states. State of Georgia just tried to ban Abby Martin from speaking at a university over there. CARE Georgia ended up suing and winning on her behalf. CARE Texas won on behalf of a school teacher who was supporting the BDS movement as well. So you see this continuously popping up. So this is a very fast-moving set of laws that's taking place here in the U.S. And the question is, where are all the free speech warriors during this time when the rights of pro-Palestine and pro-BDS speakers are coming out? So it's just interesting to see how that's going.
That's what I was just, I guess it doesn't make sense, but I'm sitting here like, how can this be outlawed? Like, I've never understood. When I first learned about BDS, I was like, there's got to be something more here. Like, I don't understand how they could even like outlaw this, or criminalize it. This is a non-violent, protest and direct action of boycotting products. It's so weird to me. I just don't understand. And it is a free speech issue. And I think what they try to do is
for no other country. So you can you can say I want to boycott America,
Right.
and like that's not a problem. But if you boycott, the state of Israel, which gets billions of dollars of our military aid every year, then that can be criminalized. So it's absurd.
Wild. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the criminalization of BDS is a sign that it works. That's like a, that it's harming the state of Israel and Zionists in general.
Yeah.
So yeah,
They're
means that it's
threatened by
working.
it. I mean, if Netanyahu goes to the UN and has to talk about it at the UN, it's clearly a threat.
Definitely.
Yeah, that leads perfectly into my next question, which is about this issue of apartheid. I think it's a word that the mainstream America is hearing more and more used to describe Israel and the sort of different ways that Israel governs its Jewish citizens versus non-Jewish or Arab citizens, and the ways in which it occupies Palestinian land and really holds Palestinians hostage on their land. Can we talk about, this is for both of you, but maybe Miriam first, then Imran. Can you talk about what we mean by apartheid and why Israel is in fact an apartheid state?
Yeah, totally. So a basic definition of apartheid is that it means applying policies of social, political, and economic segregation to a group of people. So if you know anything about the state of Israel, you see this very clearly. I think it's pretty helpful to make comparisons between apartheid South Africa and Israel. But one of the main aspects of the state of Israel that really drives that point home is that if you are defined as Jewish under Israeli law, you are governed by civilian law, while Arabs are governed under Israeli military law. So that's just like the biggest one for me. But other kind of like aspects of apartheid that Israel employs on Palestinians is the displacement of Palestinians to build illegal settlements and the destruction of homes. Murder, torture, unlawful imprisonment used as deterrence, especially against activists and women activists, preventing Palestinians from returning home to their lands, both in the diaspora and in occupied Palestine. And then, of course, the systemic abuse of fundamental human rights against Palestinians simply for holding Palestinian identity. And then, of course, the restriction of movement as well.
Thank you for that, Miriam.
Yeah.
Breaking that all down. Imran, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Miriam laid it out really well. And excuse me if I freeze it all. I don't know if there's a little bit of instability in my internet connection, but you see it in front of your eyes. So it was plausible deniability for many years leading up to the age of like cell phones, just as though the Black American community has been constantly brutalized by the police throughout our country's history, but up until just the past few years, where people actually like capturing this abuse and this torture and these murders on their cell phones and broadcasting it to the public. This is when it started hitting the public's consciousness. But same thing with Palestine. This has been going on for 75 years. You've seen, the Nakba taking place in 1948, where, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced and not been able to return to their homeland. They're just completely unaccounted for. And, my brother-in-law is Palestinian as well. And just to see how his family in Gaza has been treated, 9 of whom who were killed in the 2014 bombing campaign, one of whom was killed in this last bombing campaign a few weeks back as well. And just their life living blockaded on all sides is being documented. Separate roads for settlers and Jewish citizens of Israel versus Palestinians, separate buses which Palestinian workers are expected to ride on, checkpoints which people are stranded for hours and hours, only hoping to be let in or come back home or to go to school or to return back home. People dying at these checkpoints from lack of medical care. So many pregnant women who have died and lost their children just because of lack of medical care, people whose relatives have died from, cancer, lack of cancer treatment, being stranded and turned away at these types of checkpoints, from a religious perspective, like Masjid al-Aqsa is the third most holiest site in Islam, and most Muslims are not allowed to go and pray there. It's there's been, over the course of the past 35, 40 years, just massive restrictions, where they had restrictions on people, 60 or 70 and under are not allowed to pray over there. And like, it's just very arbitrary, and, you're tear gassed and shot at constantly. So it's no type of life. Imagine living under these types of circumstances for over 75 years, generations upon generations, experiencing nothing but this occupation. So, if you saw this happening to any other populace of people, this would be unconscionable, but it's been normalized by our government and upheld by our government with our tax dollars, and our corporations within the United States are profiting from this occupation, like corporations like Caterpillar, who are like using land moving equipment, earth moving equipment to build these walls and to demolish homes, and Boeing to build these types of bombs and things like that.
A lot of money attached to all this.
Yeah, exactly. You're getting subsidized for upholding this apartheid.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, it's like what you're talking about, like the conditions that people have been living under for generations is horrific. And I think that there's just been this mythology created around this mythology narrative around what Israel is and the creation of Israel and all this. That's just been fed to the American people, since 1948. And I think that we're starting to see cracks in that, like you said, in large part because of social media. Miriam, I wanted to talk, Falastinyat talks about the diaspora of Palestinians, and this is just my perspective. Tell me if this is true or not. It seems like compared to other diasporic communities, we don't really think about or talk about the Palestinian diaspora. Like I guess I knew that, yeah, there's probably Palestinians outside of Palestine, but I never really thought about the Palestinian diaspora. It seems like it almost doesn't exist. Why do you think that is? Is that your perspective as well?
Well, no, because I grew up learning about the diaspora only within the context of Palestine. Before I was as educated as I am now, thought that the word was created for the Palestinians. Yeah, so I want to push back a little bit and say that it's not that folks don't think or talk about it, it's that the state of Israel and Zionists as a whole strategically have worked to erase and silence Palestinians in the diaspora and in occupied Palestine, because the work that we do threatens them. Just like how they try to outlaw BDS, it's because it threatens their fragile state. So yeah, and through school, my own experience through college, I was the only one talking about Palestine, thinking about Palestine, researching about Palestine, and that was on purpose, on the side of Israel and the Zionists. But it is important to note that while Palestine has only recently entered the mainstream, that Palestinians in the diaspora and in occupied Palestine have been working tirelessly to dismantle Israel's and the Zionist propaganda, and to mobilize and educate our communities and our allies. And all of that work is finally coming to light during this third intifada. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about, you kind of briefly talked about how you got involved in Falastinyat because your sister was involved. Can you just tell me a bit more about you and your sister and how she and some other women came to create Falastinyat, and then how you got involved and kind of, I'm interested about you as a person and you and your sister specifically, I guess.
Yeah, so since I can remember, my sister has always been extremely radical, doing a lot of amazing work, starting the super at at Western Washington University. And I watched her go through that process and grow from it, and I learned from it, and I watched all of the backlash that she got and her group got. And it just honestly inspired me to want to do the same work, and I finally made it. But the way that Falastinyat was founded was that it was just a group of 4 Palestinian women, my sister included, and the Palestinian community in Seattle is fairly small, so they had been working together and learning together for quite a long time. I'm not exactly sure if starting the group was an idea for a while, but it happened. And I do know that before this third intifada, they worked really hard on creating those connections and relationships across movements. And now it's paying off, and people are showing up for us because we showed up for them.
That's awesome.
Like that, we very strongly believe in an intersectional movement, because without the liberation of everyone, there is no true liberation.
Yes. You all don't only identify as Palestinian rights activists, you identify as feminist.
Yeah.
And going back to that phrasing in your Falastiniyat's description, which is your work is happening at the intersection of gender justice and anti-colonialism. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, like why gender justice and anti-colonialism together, and how does gender inform the work that you all do?
Totally. Well, none of us are men, so there's that. It informs our daily lives. But women, and specifically trans women, are always the most oppressed under any type of colonialism, settler colonialism, state violence, anything. So with that, true gender justice has to be anti-colonial or decolonial, because you can't fight for gender justice and not also fight for the dismantling of these systems that kind of oppressed us all in the first place. And we draw a lot from the Palestinian Feminist Collective, which I think everyone watching this live should look up. We recently signed a pledge earlier this year talking about how Palestine is a feminist issue. And some examples of that is how gender violence has long been used as a tool to deter resistance. And that's not only true for Palestine, it's true for a lot of regimes around the world. But just like the overall limiting of reproductive health and safety access, body autonomy and safety, as well as systemically using sexual and physical abuse and torture to deter women activists who, again, not only in the case of Palestine, but women are usually on the front lines, leading the resistance against the Zionist regimes. So
it seems like a lot of times men get more of the coverage, or like you see men more, but in actuality, numbers wise, there's just as many, if not more. I'm thinking of the protests in Sudan that happened a couple years ago, where there's just a ton of women leading and being out in that, and that time we actually see them because that one powerful picture of that woman. But I think that's often the case.
Yeah, it is. And it sucks because the women are usually the ones on the ground doing the most work, and we're also the ones who are the most oppressed by whatever we're protesting. So while men may be a little bit louder and take up more space, we're always here doing the work.
Yeah. It's the Palestinian Feminist Collective, you said?
Yes.
Okay, I'll put a link to that in the comments once we're done with the live stream. Imran, I wanted to talk a bit about something here locally that's going on. Last week, Seattle City Council member Kashama Sawant was joined by 2 of her fellow Seattle City Council members, Lisa Herbold and Teresa Mosqueda, in signing a letter calling for the condemnation of Israel's strikes on Gaza. They also announced plans to introduce legislation that would ban Seattle police from, quote, engaging in training with Israeli military and police. Can you tell us more about this, Imran, and talk about what is happening with the push for this legislation banning SPD from training with Israeli military and police? Are you there, Imran?
Yeah, this is just one of those things that we're seeing as an intersectional issue throughout the country, where the police over here in the United States are becoming increasingly militarized, whether it's places like Seattle, whether it's places like Atlanta, New York, and Phoenix, and so on and so forth, where in this era of endless war and the global war on terrorism, you see this just continuous move to militarize police departments. And when there's protests that are taking place against, like the death of George Floyd and so many others, like these lethal tactics being used, like tear gassing and kettling and containment, that are mirrored by what Israeli police are using against the Palestinian people. And so there's been a constant stream of police departments that have been utilized, sent overseas to Israel to train with their police departments to use these types of tactics in order to subdue and to subjugate and humiliate whichever communities they're operating against, the same way the Israeli police are utilizing against Palestinians. So Seattle PD is one of those police departments that have used this deadly exchange trainings. I'm sure Miriam can talk a little bit more about this as well, but it's refreshing to see that at least like some policymakers are making a movement to stop these trainings that are taking place, because all of our realities are connected. This violence that's taking place over here is connected to the violence that's taking place against the Palestinian people, and this militarization. This, if you want to take a step back, this is the violence that's used against Palestinians. Like it's a process of dehumanization. Like they basically dehumanize the population that this violence is taking place. It's being portrayed by policymakers in the media that, oh, these people deserve it, and that it's this Blue Lives Matter movement also contributes to that as well. Same thing happens over here. Like historically, you've been told that the violence against Black and brown communities is justified, and these police tactics are justified. So we need policymakers to push back against this. So this is one of hopefully many city councils and elected officials that are going to try and push back against these departments and defund these types of trainings that are brought upon by like groups like the ADL, to bring Israeli tactics to the United States.
I'm sorry, did you say the ADL is involved in making these trainings?
Yeah, they are involved with these police exchanges that are being used over there. So that's one of their primary programs, that they take police departments overseas to train in Israel and bring these tactics back here.
I did not know that. That's good to know.
Walk over to my office afterward, we'll discuss.
We'll talk more about it.
Lots to say about the ADL, I'm sure.
Yeah. I wanted to shift to talking a bit about direct action and how it differs from other kind of action. And just to be totally open and honest with you guys, I have a general idea of like what direct action looks like, but to me it seems like one of those words, I'm a media person, I'm not an organizer necessarily. And so it's something that I hear about, but I don't quite have a grasp on like what it is. And I also wanted, this is kind of a long question, I wanted to talk about the barriers that exist in things like trying to get mainstream media coverage of events, of actions. I'm thinking about, there was the pro-Palestinian protest, or the protest against what was happening, what Israel was doing in Gaza a couple weeks ago, organized on the east side over Redmond area. And there was like 3,000 some people who showed up, and the media didn't cover it at all. But they did cover a counter protest of, there's like a small pro-Israel protest where there was maybe a couple hundred people showed up. And so my question is, what is direct action? Why is it important? And how do we circumvent the traditional gatekeepers and get our message out? Like what is the power of direct action, I guess, especially in the face of kind of these traditional gatekeepers?
I just want to make one correction. I think that the action that you're referring to, was it one that Falastinyat organized?
I thought so. I
Okay, so
confusing
that
myself
was
with-
actually at Westlake in Seattle.
Mm.
Yeah, so it wasn't on the east side. There were a couple actions on the east side that we don't align with, so I just
Okay.
wanted to clear that up.
Gotcha. Oh, you
But
guys
yes.
did the Westlake one.
Yeah.
Which did get a bit of media coverage.
It got a little, you know.
I wouldn't really call it coverage, okay? Imran
Yeah.
can speak to that as well. They
Mhm.
used an Iranian flag for, I don't know if you saw it, Como or Cairo. It was really bad. So there's that. I mean, the coverage was, I wouldn't even call it coverage. And then there
Yeah.
were other protests later on the east side that didn't get any coverage as well. So yeah, I just want to get your thoughts on all of that.
For sure. So starting from the beginning,
Yeah.
So direct action means different things to different people. To me personally, direct action is an action that has a target, a purpose, or a goal. Some of those goals could be to incite chaos, which is a tactic, to spread police forces thin across the city, which is another tactic, or in the case of block the boat, targeting something specific for the sake of, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So personally, I think it's kind of a broad term. But yeah, so, and to answer the second part of your question, on second and third, direct action is important because if it's done correctly, it's coming from the grassroots level. And so when something comes from the grassroots level, it's usually being organized by folks who are on the ground doing the work, and who are also most oppressed by whatever they're targeting. So those are the people to listen to, those are the actions to show up for. And that in itself inherently circumvents gatekeepers who usually reside at the top. And to talk a little bit about the low media coverage at Westlake, as Palestinian activists, this is nothing new to us, but we'd had thousands of folks show up from our community, from outside communities show up to support Palestinian liberation, many of whom continue to show up for Block the Boat and other actions that we've put on and continue to follow us. And that's what really matters, is that we're having more people show up, care, and understand what Palestinian liberation really means.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Imran, before I want to ask Miriam one follow-up question. How much do you think, why is this shift happening? And how much do you think social media has to do with this?
Oh, is that for me?
Oh, Miriam, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, so social media definitely plays a part, as we've seen from Muna and Mohammed El-Kurd in Palestine and Sheikh Jarrah. But also, I think that we need to attribute a lot of our success from the ongoing struggle for Black liberation, because I think that a lot of folks have been mobilized from the last year and are down to show up for other, other movements and other issues. So I do think that we need to credit that movement a lot, and we do owe them a lot of our success, and that's why we continue to build relationships across movements.
Yeah, awesome. And Imran, can I get your thoughts as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing just to be part of a city and a state that has this robust culture of activism. So that's something that I'm obviously somebody who's important to the state, happy to see that, because coming from a place like Arizona, that there wasn't that infrastructure that's there, and just seeing the younger generation come up and really taking the lead is something that's inspiring. And yeah, I mean, social media is definitely something that's helped that. I think, decentralizing where that information is coming from has helped quite a bit. Yeah, I mean, if you just juxtapose that versus appearing on the media, they called me at the very last second, they probably needed somebody from the community to come and talk about what was going on with Palestine. I knew it was sort of a trap, because this is a local station, found out later was a Sinclair station. And so, I mean, I had this nice 15-point, list of things that I covered, like what was going on in Sheikh Jarrah, like the displacement, how this whole campaign started, and what it was all boiled down to was just a both sides type situation. So no matter what,
they used a clip of you just saying like, of course we care about peace, and
it's like yeah, we just want the bombing to stop, and so that's the narrative that they ended up coming up with at the end of it. So it's really, at the end of the day, you're not going to be reliant on many of these outlets to really carry on your story, but people like Miriam and her sister and so many others who are taking the lead and getting out there and putting their lives and their bodies on the line in order to make a difference. That's where you're going to see that difference. And I think it's inspiring people in our communities to come out and like be bold. Like historically, you may not have seen people who are willing to go out there and maybe attend a Black Lives Matter protest and shut things down. But now I took my kids to a protest and took Willa a few months back, and that's something that's changed their lives, something that they're going to see remember for the rest of their lives. And I think it demystifies things for a lot of people. So thank you to Miriam and Falastiniyat for really taking that lead.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Miriam. You've talked about the parallels between U.S. settler. Thank you, Imran. You talked about the parallels between U.S. settler colonialism and what has happened and what is happening in Israel and occupied Palestine. For years, me personally, when I would hear the word colonialism, I would think history books. I would think Christopher Columbus, Britain, India.
Yeah.
Like I literally, probably until my early 20s, didn't realize that this is something that is alive and well in our world. Can you talk about settler colonialism and colonialism in general and how it relates to what is being done to the Palestinians by the Israeli government?
Definitely. And sorry about my cat. This is Rika.
Oh, I didn't see. Oh,
yeah, she's here now. So unfortunately, settler colonialism is thriving, as you said, and it's alive and well. And I'm specifically, and it continues to haunt the land that it occupies. And I'm thinking of the recent 1,505 recovered remains of Indigenous children found at schools across Canada last week. And it's not only Christopher Columbus who is to blame for the Indigenous genocide, just like it's not only the Israeli government who's to blame for the occupation of Palestine. It's every single Zionist settler taking up space in Palestine, and it's every single Zionist outside of Palestine funding, supporting, and blindly following the Zionist state of Israel. And everyone who continues to live on stolen land until it's returned to its rightful owners are complicit. And it's the same for folks living here on Turtle Island. We're all complicit until the land is returned to the Indigenous people, just like all settlers in Israel are complicit until the land is returned to the Palestinians. So to answer kind of your question, there are a ton of parallels between the settler colonialism in the United States and Israel. A few examples are the demolition of villages, houses, and homes, the ruining of the land itself, uprooting olive trees, ruining water here with pipelines, all of that, displacing the Indigenous peoples, restricting movement, cultural erasure, economic deprivation, racist policing, mass incarceration, all of that. Yeah, and Palestinian liberation is a feminist issue, but it's also an Indigenous issue. And I think that if more folks who aren't, as in tune to the issue of Palestine, if they continue to make these parallels between the Indigenous genocide on Turtle Island and in this area to that of Palestine, they will continue to see like all of the parallels and the ways that we can hopefully reverse that.
It's
as you're talking. I'm sorry, go ahead, Imran.
Yeah, just to add real quick to what she said is, like I think a lot of times when you're dealing with your elected officials and the media, you're distracted by these phrases like two-state solution and this solution and peace process. There's no peace process.
Right.
There's no two-state solution. Like,
Yeah.
if you're embracing a two-state solution, you're basically embracing apartheid for
Right.
Palestinians. You're basically throwing away all the Palestinians that were driven out in 1948, who are like living in places like Lebanon and Jordan and Syria, they're still Palestinians where they're sitting. They're not citizens of the places that they are. They're in Kuwait and different places. And if you embrace that terminology, then you're essentially throwing these millions of people away who have no right to return to their home. So we have to also just catch these little, phrases that they've been trying to throw out throughout history, these past 40, 50 years. There's no peace process that really exists. There's only liberation for Palestinians.
Right.
Language is language shapes how we think about things. It shapes how we can think about things. Until we hear differently, it's like we can't think differently. And I think when you were talking, Miriam, about the parallels, I was raised in what I would call like Christian Zionist household. So it was very like pro-Israel, and the church that my family went to had a Israeli flag next to an American flag, yada yada. And I was also homeschooled and taught a very warped version of American history. And I remember being told that, and as you're talking, I'm like, this is a colonialist narrative. I was taught that when Israel went in there, or when the Jewish people, settlers from Europe came in, there was basically nothing there. The land was barren. They weren't growing anything. There wasn't any, quote, civilization. And that the Jewish people came in there and built all the stuff up and planted olive trees and planted. And that's the exact same thing that my father also told me about the native, indigenous people in the US.
Right.
That there basically was nothing here.
Yeah.
They weren't organized. They weren't doing anything with the land. It's the same narrative.
It is. It really is. Yeah. The parallels are pretty insane, honestly. Like, not very original, but
yeah. It's just regurgitating the same old.
Definitely.
And tweaking a few things.
Yeah.
So where do we go? What's happening now? I know, the part of the reason we wanted to do this episode is that there was kind of this moment where there was a lot of eyes on what was happening in occupied Palestine.
Yeah.
It was actually making the news more than usual. And now, of course, the news cycle has moved on and it's kind of died down. So what's going on right now? What does the way forward look like? And what do people need to know? Question for both of you guys.
Well, the occupation is still active and alive, and people are being displaced all over Palestine. One that hopefully folks have heard of is in Silwan. They're displacing people to build a water park. So Falastinyat is working on a couple of things right now. We're working on the legislative aspects that we talked about a little bit earlier, and we have a few things in the works, but just continue to educate yourself, educate your peers and your community. Don't stop showing up to actions. Follow Falastinyat on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And also follow our affiliated groups, the International League of People's Struggles, ILPS, which also has an Instagram page and I'm sure a Facebook page. And the Deadly Exchange Seattle, which is working on that legislation as well. And then the Palestinian Feminist Collective, which we already kind of talked about. But yeah, just like continuing to, pay attention, engage in BDS. If you see that one of your local stores sells a lot of Israeli products, maybe start a campaign at the store. And as always, uplift feminist and like non-men Palestinian voices as much as possible.
Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to close out. I mean, we're here to support as well. I mean, from our side, we're out there advocating on a state, federal, and local level as well, and we're going to continue to uplift the local voices. Like I said, it's great to have so many of the younger generation like really coming up. So we're here to uplift and support these types of actions and speak out on behalf of the oppressed peoples of the world as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think overarching narrative is that the ceasefire from a media perspective is like where the coverage halts, but that doesn't mean that the apartheid and the occupation has halted even one little bit in places like Sheikh Jarrah and so on, and Beta and many others. Like their people are being driven out and their homes being demolished on a daily basis. And it's as much of an outrage today as it was a few weeks back. And so we have to continue to stay outraged and still keep that level of energy to ensure that our Palestinian brothers and sisters are supported.
Yes. Thank you, Imran. Thank you for that. Before we go, Miriam, how can people follow Falastiniyat? What is the handle on Instagram?
It's just Falastiniyat. Yeah,
Okay.
it's just our name as it's spelled on my screen.
Beautiful. Okay, awesome. I'll put, you mentioned some of those different organizations. I'll put those comments as well so that people can check them. Youth Advocacy Committee members, the YAC, and Nejma Osman, who is our, oh my gosh, my brain is going blank.
Youth and Advocacy Coordinator.
Okay, I thought her title, Youth and Advocacy Coordinator. We're going to be talking basically about the opportunity pipeline that we're creating at Care Washington, some of the youth work that Nejma's been leading, and youth empowerment and advocacy in general. And Miriam, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was a really good conversation, and maybe we can have you guys back on later.
Yeah, definitely.
Be awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.